Good morning, everyone. I'm George Varas. My co-chair is John Chaousis, and I'd like to welcome you all to this first session of the day, which will deal with colon cancer, and especially will focus on the most difficult part of the colonic resection, which refers to transverse colon. We have today three distinguished speakers to cover the topic, and I would like to ask John to introduce the first speaker.
Good morning. I would like to start with the first speaker. First speaker is coming from Dresden, Germany. He's Dr. Stelzner. He's actually a close friend of colorectal games since speakers in the last 3, 4 or more colorectal games. I don't remember actually, I remember you.
I only missed the first one.
Okay, so seven colorectal games. He has worked on surgical anatomy in Kiel with Professor Wigel, so we have the chance to hear from him very interesting things and details of the surgical anatomy, mainly of transverse colon. Dr. Stelzner, please.
Well, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Dear Professor Xynos, thank you very much for this kind invitation to speak again about anatomy as a surgeon. But as you may know, my anatomical partner is Professor Wedel from Kiel, with whom I did all of the anatomical dissections. So the topic today is from the hepatic to the splenic flexure, surgical anatomy basis for complete mesocolic excision. I have spoken a couple of times about the business of embryologic fusions and releasing these fusions after the rotation of the large bowel within the abdominal cavity, as you all know, 270 degrees anti-clockwise around the axis of the superior mesenteric artery. This time I have to speak about this organ, which is hardly to be seen if you open the abdominal cavity. The transverse colon is covered by the omentum, and you have to lift it up before you get access to this organ, which is the topic of my speech today. And on the right side, you see a clinical case that will run through and act as a reference for what I would like to explain regarding the anatomy of this peculiar part of the colon between the hepatic and the splenic flexure. So what do we have to consider? We have to consider its relationship to the greater omentum. We have to look at the hepatic and the splenic flexure. Then we will turn to the pancreas, which is in intimate relation to it. And at the end, I will investigate with you the vessels that supply the transverse colon. Let's start with the great omentum. Unfortunately, the part that covers the colonic wall is almost every time rather thin. But we can actually get in between and separate the two structures. The great omentum belongs to the foregut and the transverse colon to the midgut. And you can see, as a rule, you can nicely open this embryologic plane, and you see the posterior leaf of the greater omentum above and the anterior leaf of the transverse mesocolon below. But every now and then there is a tiny vessel crossing these two embryologic compartments, and there is suspicion that these vessels also can go lymph vessels, and that is a pathway, a potential pathway for lymphatic spread. So we have to come to embryology and look how this area develops. And this is a common opinion that the dorsal mesogastrium moves to the right and covers the transverse colon like an apron, and with it the lesser sac forms. The lower part of this double fold fuses somehow. The lesser sac remains between the stomach and the pancreas, and the transverse mesocolon also fuses with the backside of the dorsal mesogastrium. We can separate the two, but if we speak about transverse colonic cancer, as I've said, there might be potential pathways for lymphatic spread, and for that reason, there is a chance that lymph nodes in the foregut compartment along the greater curvature are involved as well. And that's why we have to remove the greater omentum if we deal with colonic cancer of the transverse colon or of either of the flexures. So let's turn to the hepatic flexure. The omentum is almost entirely lifted. You can see it is rather difficult to do it without a hole, or at least it was in this case. What is always easy is to release the hepatic flexure from the peritoneum. There is no such thing like a ligament. That is something this group of Culligan and Coffey worked out rather nicely. It can be released along the peritoneal fold, and if that is a little bit thicker, you can address it as a kind of a peritoneal condensation. But there is no such thing like a ligament in this area. But what we also found when releasing the greater omentum from the transverse colon were some tiny vessels crossing again these two compartments at this side of the transverse colon. And as well, the vessels of the gastrocolic trunk come into the operating field. And you need to be very careful in this area when releasing the hepatic flexure not to tear these delicate veins. I will come to that in a minute. Otherwise, releasing the mesocolic package from the parietal package on the right side is the mainstay of CME and is rather easy. You can see nicely this plane and the ascending mesocolon separated from it. And it goes over the duodenum and the pancreas. This is the clinical case. You can again see this in real life, the ascending and transverse mesocolon being released within this embryologic interface from the dorsal organs of the body in this area, not only from the parietal side but also from the duodenum, where it is fixed during the embryologic rotation. And the first point that connects these two planes is the gastrocolic trunk. You can see nicely a pancreatic duodenal vein joining the superior right colic vein. Let's go to the other side, to the splenic fracture. Again, we can release, if you wish, the greater omentum from the bowel wall, but as well, we found some tiny vessels that crossed the two compartments. There's the greater omentum, the transverse colon down there. If we mobilize the splenic flexure, we can again get into this fascial interface between the parietal fascia and the mesocolic fascia. From the descending mesocolon, you can see the inferior mesenteric vein there, and the transverse mesocolon. But if you go along the parietal fascia, you enter the area behind the pancreas, and there is something peculiar to it, because the meso of the left and left transverse colon is continuous, with the meso of the pancreas. So we have to give the pancreas some considerations. This is the clinical case a little bit further. And again, you can see the pancreas is lifted with the mesocolic package. And we have to sharply divide this continuous meso, which encompasses not only the transverse or descending mesocolon, but also the tail of the pancreas. Again, this is a sketch concerning embryology. We also saw this fusion of the transverse mesocolon with the dorsal mesogastrium. And textbooks draw it like this. Somehow the two interfaces are connected. But is it the truth? Clinical experience suggests that it is rather a continuous plane that encircles the tail of the pancreas. And this was investigated by a Japanese group who looked how the transverse colon developed in this area, and they could show that it pushes against the tail of the pancreas, and that the plane that covers the transverse colon is somehow continuous, or becomes continuous, with this foregut structure of the pancreas. So there is an embryologic peculiarity that does not entirely fit into our imagination of embryologic planes and releasing them, but in this area you have, in the end of the day, to cut the two compartments and to get access or to stay on the colonic side if you want to release it from the pancreatic compartment. So that will be this line. There is the mesopancreas. You can nicely see this mesofascial interface, which continues just behind the pancreas, but if you want to release the transverse mesocolon, you have to go along this way. And this area comes from the greater omentum. It was released from the left side, and again, there is no such a thing like a splenocolic or phreniocolic ligament. So back to our clinical case, you have to keep on the mesocolic side and to incise this area to get the two apart. So back to the anatomical lab. We look at this area from behind. The transverse colon is lifted up. You can see the transverse mesocolon. This area, this is the duodenojejunal flexure. The parietal part is released from the descending mesocolon, and you have to cut along this line to separate the pancreas. From anterior, it is a little bit like the same. You have got the pancreas lying there. There might be or might be not a thin leaf of the greater omentum, as I showed in the beginning. There is the middlecolic artery supplying the transverse colon, but we could also show that there are tiny vessels crossing the pancreatic territoria, the pancreatic vascular territoria, and the colonic territory. And again, we hypothesized that this might be a potential pathway for lymphatic spread, and that is the rationale to dissect lymph nodes at the lower border of the pancreas as well. And this is the separation of the anterior leaf between the transverse mesocolon and the pancreas. And there the duodenum, or the duodenojejunal flexure, is shining through. Then we have reached the area of the vessels. There is the inferior mesenteric vein, also crossing two embryologic parts, the hindgut and the midgut, towards the foregut. and the vessels that directly supply the transverse mesocolon, the middle colic artery, and the middle colic vein coming from the, or flowing towards the superior mesenteric vein. So let's start with the artery. This is the situs when we can release the superior mesenteric artery with its branches, inferior pancreatic duodenal artery, jejunal arteries, and this is the first colonic artery that runs towards the transverse colon as the middle colic artery, and sometimes it gives off a right branch that represents the right colic artery. But there's a large variability in this area. The ileocolic artery and left colic artery are almost always there, but in between there is variability, especially with the right colic artery, which is missing in about a quarter of cases, and which is there as a true right colic artery coming from the superior mesenteric artery in only 15 to about 40%. The middle colic artery is also variable. It is almost always there, but in about half of the cases there are more than one vessels supplying this area, and we have to give attention to it. Sometimes a branch runs with this inferior mesenteric vein, and if we operate on the left side of the colon, we have to make sure that blood supply is still sufficient when we cut this accessory artery. The connection between the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery is sometimes threefold. There is the marginal artery, or Drummond's artery, which is almost always there, only in 3% is this missing. There is the Ryolands arcade in between, which is very variable, and every now and then, in about 10%, there is the intermesocolic arch connecting directly the superior mesenteric artery with the inferior mesenteric artery. So that is what we have to keep in mind when we deal with the middle colic artery. And the middle colic vein has a relationship to the gastrocolic trunk. We have shown it here. There is the superior mesenteric vein. The middle colic vein runs into it directly in this case. And there are right colic veins, pancreaticoduodenal veins, and the right gastroepiploic vein that form the gastrocolic trunk of Himmler. And you have to be very cautious in this area because these veins are very delicate, and if you do not pay enough attention to it, it can bleed quite heavily, and this bleeding point was always part of Professor Hohenberger's teaching, and that's why we call it Hohenberger's junction. So, we are back to our clinical case on the right side, as I have shown the connection of the superior right colic vein and the pancreaticoduodenal vein. So this is left if we have removed the transverse colon. We have taken the choroidamentum at the greater curvature, we have released the transverse mesocolon from the lower border of the pancreas, we have freed the anterior lateral side of the superior mesenteric vein, but we have left the superior mesenteric artery covered. Why that? Because there run the nerves. These sympathetic nerves that supply the small intestine, and if you damage them, that can result in intractable diarrhea, hardly to be treated. So I come to my conclusion. We went from the hepatic to the splenic flexure, and back I have to say. We took down the middle colic artery, the inferior mesenteric vein, and the middle and the right colic veins. We released this area of mesocolic fascia. You can see this was attached to the dorsal organs, the parietal fascia, to the duodenum and the pancreas on the right side. And this makes us a complete mesocolic excision. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank the team in Kiel for hosting me to do this kind of dissections, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Stelzner, very much for your excellent presentation with impressive imaging. I would like to ask the audience if there are any questions, please. Professor Snow.
You mentioned that there is a continuity of the peritoneum covering the upper aspect of the transverse mesocolon, and this goes around the pancreas and comes back again in front. So, if this is the case, is there any lymphatic connection which obliges us in total, in complete mesocolic excision to coexcise along with the specimen, the peritoneum covering the pancreas, as we do, for example, in the D2 gastrectomies?
Well, I think we are not there yet. But to make it clear, it is not a peritoneal covering, but it is a mesocovering. The visceral meso covers all visceral organs. There are only a few connections to the parietal part of the abdominal wall. It is the large vessels, the hepatic vessels, and the inlet and the outlet, the esophagus and the anus. And the rest of the visceral package is covered by the visceral meso and is within the parietal meso. Your question is whether we should enhance radicality concerning the pancreas and to remove its meso as well. I think there is not yet enough clinical evidence to do that. Professor Hohenberger's group has shown that in about 10% of transverse and splenic colonic cancers, you can find lymph nodes outside the colonic package, so along the greater curvature, along the lower border of the pancreas and the pyloric lymph nodes. I think Professor Hohenberger will turn to that in his presentation. He will just give us now.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other? That's to ask you something, Sigmar. How often do you meet the artery branches, the arterial branches coming from hepatic or splenic fracture to gastroepiploic vessels? I mean, in which percentage? How often do you meet?
Oh, I see. You mean these small vessels?
Yeah.
That cross the two aperitory compartments. I think in every second case you find this kind of vessels if you look closely, but they are very tiny, and to my mind it is not quite clear yet whether involvement of lymph nodes or involvement of the greater omentum at large is due to a lymphatic spread or rather due to direct spread in the greater omentum.
Okay, thank you.